So today we're going to be creating this printing effect, and it's actually based on what are known as ink plotters, and you can see some of them on YouTube if you want to get an idea of what they're like. The techniques we'll be looking at today include dynamic paint. We'll be looking at the hook modifier, and we'll also be looking at some constraints to create a basic rig. We'll then be repeating animation using the graph editor, and we'll also use some graph editor modifiers to alter the animation curves. And then finally, we'll be doing a bit of compositing just to create that vector blur. Now, you may notice that my scene isn't completely empty, and I will explain what these objects are in a second. But the first thing I'm going to do is explain the basic technique that we're going to use to create the printing effect. And we're actually going to use something called dynamic paint, and that allows one object to effectively paint a colour onto another object. And so our actual pen that we're going to be using is going to be the brush, and the paper that we're printing onto is going to be the canvas. And you can think of it, instead of printing on the image that's going to be there at the end, we're actually printing on a texture which will reveal the image underneath. Now, I'll go through all that later, but I just wanted to explain the basic technique that we're going to be using, but I'll actually be going through that nearer the end of the tutorial after we've done the animation. So the first thing we need to do is actually set up a basic rig to allow easy animation of these objects. And all of these are basic primitives. These are just two cylinders that have been joined, and this is just an extruded cube which has been subsurfed and then mirrored, and this object here, which is going to act as our actual pen, it's a bit more complex, but it's really nothing more than basic cylinders and a bit of an array system that's bent into a circle there. Now you may notice this object here, and this is the object that we're actually going to be using to do the painting. Now you may think that's weird, seeing as we've got an object here which looks pretty much like a pen, but if we were to use this to paint onto our object, it would simply take too long for the animation to complete, because that's a very small nib, and it would have to cover a lot of space to create the whole image. Now you can do that, it would just take longer. I'm actually going to use a bigger object to do the painting, and this is actually going to be our controller object, which everything else follows. So what I'm first going to do is put it into position of where I want it to be, and that should be pretty much lining up with the other nib, and I'm actually going to change this display mode to be wire so we can actually see what's going on, and we may change it later, but for now that's a pretty good position for it. So the first thing we're going to do is set up a few constraints so that this bar follows this object. Now we could parent it, but this object's actually going to be moving up and down, and the bar should only move in the Y direction. So we're going to use a constraint called copy location, and this object is called pen. So I'm going to set that to be the target here. So P pen. We don't want it to follow on the Z or the X, and you can see it's jumped back to its original position. And if I move this now, you can see all that's happening is that it's following in the Y axis, which is what we want. So I'm going to do the same for this object here. So add a constraint, copy location, pen, not the X or the Z, and again that should be set up. Now I'm going to do a similar thing for this object, which is basically just the main base which is holding the pen, but this time we're going to be not only copying the Y, but we're also going to be using the X as well, but we're not going to use the Z. This means that if we move it across, it's going to follow, and if we move up and down, it's going to follow, but it's not going to move up and down. We're then going to set this object to be a parent of this, and Control P, keep the transform, so now that should be following as well, and I'm also going to parent these cables. And these should be parented to this main base as well. Let's Control P. Now all the objects make up the main pen, so this object, and these, and this. So this whole pen object is actually going to be fully parented to this because we want this to move in all directions. So Control P and keep the transform. And so if I move this, we can see the pen is moving up and down as it should, or as I want it to, but everything else is only moving in the direction that I've set it to. So what I basically imagined was that these little rollers were kind of allowing the pen to move up and down separate from the main base. But what this also means is that I wanted these cables to follow as well, and to do that we're going to use something called hooks. And this is a modifier that you may not have used before, and what this allows is us to parent one vertex of an object to another object, and that includes control points of curves. So I'll select the object I want it to be parented to, which is this object here. I'll then shift select our curve object, tab into edit mode, select the control point and press Ctrl H, and then I want to hook to the selected object. And although it hasn't moved, it's added a modifier automatically here. And so if we move the pen up and down, you can see that curve's actually moving. But the curve's not quite in the right position, so I'm just going to manually move this point downwards so it's intersecting. And so if it moves now, you can see the curve is following. And I'm then going to do the same for the other curves. And so now that's most of our rig set up. And so moving our main pen, we can move it anywhere and everything else follows. One other thing I'm going to do is duplicate one of these curves with Shift D. I'll then remove the hook, and I'm also going to remove that blue material. And so what I'm going to do is have this curve stretch from this point to this point. So I'm just going to move it into position. And then edit some of the points. And then using hooks again, selecting this object because it's going to be hooked to that. Shift select this object. I'll then select both of these control points, press Ctrl H, hook to selected object. We're then going to parent this object to this little box here with Ctrl P and keep the transform. And then if we move the pen, you can see the cable seems to be extending. Now on mine I actually added in a few other hooks, so selected this, then the curve, hooked to selected object, and then I actually reduced this so it wasn't fully hooked, but it would get some of the movement. So if you move it, it does seem to move a bit. Obviously you'd have to fine tune it because it's intersecting a bit there, but for the tutorial that's going to be alright. So now we've set up the rig, we can actually work out what image we want to appear on our plane. And for that, I've actually used a second scene. All it has is a normal text object, and this is just going to render as black because it's set to a shadeless black material. And it's got this little border here. And then the world just renders as white. So if I render that out, and then F3 to save, I'll then save it as paper texture. And this is the actual image we're going to use. Now obviously you don't have to use a 3D object to create this image, you can just use a different image you want to appear, but just to keep it within Blender, I'm using a 3D object. So switching back to our main scene, we're then actually going to UV unwrap this plane and position that image we just rendered off. And to do that I'm just going to go into edit mode, change the UV image editor, open the image that we just rendered, and then just going back into the 3D view, I'll then U and then project from view. And the reason I did it that way around is when you add an image in, it will actually change the aspect ratio of the unwrapped object. Now if you don't understand that, it doesn't matter, but doing it in this order just prevents a few errors. If I just split out the view, change it to 3D, then textured, we can see our image there. And I'm just going to try and get it a bit more central. And that should work. Now, we're not actually going to be dealing with the material or the reveal of this texture yet. The next thing we're going to do is work out how to move the pen up and down exactly where parts of our image are. Now, you could hand animate it, but the way we're going to do it actually automates that process. And I had to set up the material because we're actually going to be using a displace modifier. Now, we're not actually going to be using this plane because this is going to be where the image is revealed. And so I'm going to go into solid mode, duplicate it, still with it selected. I'm going to remove the solidify modifier that I had on there, and then I'm going to add a displace modifier. Now obviously because it's got no subdivisions, it has moved it completely and we haven't told it what image we want to use. So I'm going to tab into edit mode, W subdivide, and then I'm going to press F6 to bring up the options window, just drag that all the way up to 10, and then I'm going to repeat that. And then tabbing out of edit mode, still with the object selected, I'm going to set a new material, and then a new texture, an image, and the image we're going to use is the same image we rendered off. Now the reason why I duplicated this plane is because if we did the UV unwrapping now, when it's got a huge amount of subdivisions, it'd be very difficult. But what we did was unwrap the low poly version, which was very easy, and then subdivide it. And the subdivisions don't affect the UV unwrapping, so we can still use them. What I'm actually going to do is uncheck this box, because we want it for the displacement, but we don't actually want this texture to render at all. So just unchecking that disables it. We'll call it displace. Going back to the modifiers, we can use displace in this drop down box, and you can see it's done something but not quite what we want. So we're going to change the texture coordinates to UV, and there we can see our image, this object, which controls the position of everything, to move up and down. But this next constraint that we're going to use will explain that, and we're actually going to use the Shrinkwrap constraint. The target is going to be plane.002. If I just swap in plane, and you can see immediately our pen is moved, but we're not quite finished yet. I'm going to change it to project and then Z, so we're making sure it'll only move in the Z direction, but we're still not seeing much of a change. And what I'm actually going to do is hide some of these other objects just for the minute because they're getting in the way. Now what the Shrinkwrap constraint actually does is tell an object, which is this object, to snap to the mesh of another object, which is this object. And the way it does that, it uses the center point. And because the center point isn't near it, we haven't really seen the right effect yet. So I'm just going to go into wireframe, and we want the center point to be at the same place as the tip of our pen. So I'm going to go into edit mode, select the bottom vertices, Shift S, cursor selected. So now our cursor is at the exact point of the tip of the pen. Select our main object, and then just turning this effect off, and then doing Control Alt Shift C, we're going to do origin to 3D cursor. And then turning the Shrinkwrap constraint back on, we can see that if we move the pen, it is snapping to the top parts of the mesh. So if we goes up and then down and then up again. And all we have to adjust is the depth of this displacement to control how far it goes. So I'll bring back the other objects, and we know the lowest point we want it to go is the plane that we're going to be printing on, which is here. So at the moment we're going a bit too far. So if I just move the object so it's at the point where it's at its lowest point, and then in side view I'll change the strength of the displacement. And then I'll move the object up a bit so it matches the level of the paper. And so if I move this onto layer 2 now, and move this around, you can see it's actually jumping up and down at the points it's meant to be. To prove that, I'll just bring back the texture. It should be down at this point because that's where it should be painting. Just selecting it and moving it, we can see it moves up where it's going to be white, and it moves back down where it's going to be painting. Now what you may find at some points, and you'll only really see this once you've set up the dynamic paint, which I'll explain later, is that this object which is going to be painting doesn't always move down at the right point. It sometimes moves down a bit later, and so you can just see it here. If I move it on the x-axis, it goes up, and when it comes down, it may miss off a part of the text. Now, you won't always see this, but what I found is that to get it to work without any errors, I had to actually change the image we're using to displace. And so we're going to have two separate images. We're going to have this one, which is going to appear as the printed image, and then we're going to alter this and use that image for the displacement. And to do that, I'm going to go into the compositor, in the node editor, compositing, use nodes, and backdrop, Shift A and add an output viewer, and then Shift A, filter, dilate and erode. Link this up to the viewer, and what this does, it will expand or contract an image, and I'm just going to put it to -14, create a really expanded image, and then pressing F11 to bring up the render window. I'll then F3 to save this, and making sure we don't overwrite our paper texture, this will be our displacement texture, and we'll save that. So going back to our main scene, we will then change the texture we're using to displace. Now it looks a bit weird because we're in textured view. I'm just going to go to the texture we made on the material, and on the image I'm going to get rid of that and replace it with this new one. Now we haven't seen any change, and that's because to update the displace modifier you need to tab into edit mode and then tab back out and then go into textured mode. Now it can be a bit difficult to see because this displacement is now being textured as well, so I'm just going to set that to be solid. And doing this, make sure that the pen is always at the lowest point by the time it gets to the text, and that's just something I found I needed to do. But you may not find that you need to do it on yours, so we'll get rid of layer 2 again, so we don't need to see it. And the next thing we're going to do is the actual animation on the pen, and that's how we get it going backwards and forwards. So to do that, again, we're going to actually automate this. So I'm going to set this to be the first position, and I'm going to press I, and then location. I'm going to move forward maybe to frame 30, move it along to here, and we want to get the widest point to make sure we're going to include all of our text. We can ignore the border for the minute because we'll do that later, and then we'll do I location. And what I'm then going to do is move it down. You can essentially think of the thickness of this object as being one row of printing. So it'll print, move down a row, print, move down a row, and then continue. So we want to try and move it down the exact thickness of the object. It can be a bit difficult, but we're just going to try and guess at this. And we're actually going to move along, say, 5 frames, and then move it down roughly the thickness of one row. And it's better to overlap rather than leave a gap. And then I location. And then to get it to move back to the exact position, we're going to go back to the first keyframe, and we're going to copy its X value, which is here. So I'm just going to Control C over that. So we'll go forward another 30 frames, so to frame 60, and then paste in its X value, then I location, and then again we're going to move it down. So we're going to move along 5 frames, move it down a row, I location. So what we've essentially got here is one row, and we're going to then use the graph editor to repeat this animation. So I'm just going to bring out a new view, change it to the graph editor, and I'm actually going to delete the Z channel because we don't need it. So just selecting it and then press delete, it just gets in the way. And then selecting the X channel, I'm going to press N to bring up the toolbar, and we're going to add a modifier, and we're going to use cycles. It just repeats the motion, and so it's set to repeat motion. And then on the Y location, we actually want it to be slightly different. If we look at it now, what's going to happen? If we scroll through, you can see it's going backwards and forwards because the X animation is being repeated, but it's not going any further. So on the Y location, we don't just want it to repeat the motion. What we actually want to do is, instead of repeat motion, repeat with offset, and what happens is you get the repeated effect, and it seems to be printing. Now my timeline isn't quite long enough, so I'm just going to see the point where I want it to end, and it looks like it can end around 615, so I'll change the end point to be 615. And you can imagine that if I was using that smaller nib of the original pen, it would have taken even longer because the rows would be so much smaller. So using a bigger object can help with the speed. But what's then happening is that although we've set the end of our timeline to be here, we still haven't done the border, and that will need to be animated separately. So we now want it to stop repeating because it will just continue until we tell it to stop. And to do that, we can actually, in the modifier, set it to restrict the frame range, and immediately it's set to end at 0. We want it to end at 615, and the same for the X, restrict the frame range and end at 615. So it gets to there, and then it actually goes back to its original position. And if we look in the graph editor, and I'll just expand this out with Control and up, and if I zoom out, it's actually defaulted back to its original position, where in fact what it should do is get to here and continue at a constant rate, because this is the new position we wanted to stop at. But in fact, it's dropping back, so what we're going to do is add another modifier. So I'll just collapse that, and the modifier we're going to add is generator, and it's disappeared somewhere at the minute, so I'm just going to set this to be 0, and it is there if we move our line out the way. What it's doing is overriding our cycles and our original keyframes. So again, we need to restrict the frame range, want it to start at 615, so I'm just going to put in any value at the minute, and I'll end at 2000, and then put the beginning at 615. It's still not quite right because it's not the right value, and I don't really fully understand the generator modifier. All I know is that if you modify this value, it will generate a new line. If you click and drag and hold shift, you can do really precise movements. We're going to try and get it as close to here as we can. So if I just drag this out, and that's about dead on. And you really do want to try and get it as precise as possible. And we're then going to do the same for the Y. So we're going to add a generator, set this bottom value to 0 because I don't know what it does. Trick the frame range to end at 2000, just for the minute. Begin at 615, and here it is down below. And again, it's jumping up, so it's not quite right yet. And that will do. So if I go back and collapse this view by Control down, what we'll see is it repeats and repeats and repeats. Now what you can see here is we're getting a little jump, and I did find that before, and so what we're just going to do is set this to start at 614, and what you should really do is then adjust this value because it's going to be slightly off, but just for the tutorial I'm going to leave it, and so then scroll through and it stops. Now you may think that we can now just continue keyframing to create the border, but we can't actually do that because the modifiers we've added. The generator will overwrite any keyframes we want. So what I'm actually going to do is add another object and parent our pen to it, and then animate that one. Now you may not have to do that, but I just found it a lot simpler. So I'm just going to go to our last frame and press Shift S, cursor selected, Shift A, I'm going to add an empty, I'll then move it up, you can see it, and I'll scale it down a bit. And I'm then going to parent our pen to this object. And it doesn't affect the rest of the animation, but we get to the frame 615, and then it's this object that we're going to continue to animate. So I'm going to put a keyframe in here, and then just moving along a bit, we'll move over to our first corner, and making sure this box is fully over the corner, because that's what's going to be drawing the line. We'll then press I, location, and I'm then just going to continue round doing keyframes at the corners. And then on the final keyframe, I'm just going to move it back up to kind of the final resting position, and then one more keyframe. So now that that's finished, you can see it does the rows, and then does the border. So I'll just extend our timeline again to 741, and that's all the animation done. Now I had a little problem there, and sometimes you'll find this, is that the displace modifier, it can act a bit weird, and sometimes the image will disappear, and just tabbing in and out of edit mode again will fix that. But if we scroll through, we can see the pen going up and down where it's meant to be drawing. And now we're finally onto the part where we set up the dynamic paint. And this is how the whole thing is created. So I'm just going to select our plane, and I'm just going to go into solid view for a second. And over in the physics panel, we now have a button called dynamic paint. So I'm going to select that, and it gives us the option of adding a canvas or a brush. And this is going to be our canvas because it's going to be painted onto. So add canvas. A whole load of options then come up, but we don't really need to worry about most of them. The first thing we're going to do is change our format from vertex to image sequence. What we want at the end is an image sequence that we can use to affect another texture which reveals the final image. Now our resolution, I'm going to set this up to be 1024. You may want to play around with the resolution. It depends what you're going to render in and how close and how big your canvas is going to be. Now I'm then also going to enable substeps, and I'm going to put 10. Now to explain what substeps are, if I just advance from this frame to the next, there's a small gap in between, and this gap will be bigger if your animation is faster, where the brush is not getting. So if we rendered out the dynamic paint images, what we'd get is a black square here, and a black square to the right, and there'd be a tiny gap in between. Now, what Substeps does is say, imagine that there's frames in between and smooth out the line. Now, because the animation that I've done is quite slow, because I haven't fine-tuned it, you don't really see this effect. In my original one, where I was going quite fast, there'd be a big gap between this frame and the next, maybe from here to here. And so in between, I set it to do 10 steps to smooth out that line. Because it's so slow, I'm going to actually set it down to maybe 5, and that should be enough. I'm then going to expand the advanced panel. I'm just going to turn off dry because we don't need it. I'm not really sure what this UV map bit does, but I'm just going to put our UV map in just in case. I know I did on my original. And then we're going to choose a directory where we're going to output our dynamic paint images. And it's already created a folder, but I don't really want to use that. So I'm going to create a new directory and call it dynamic paint images, and then I will select that and accept it. And the name I'm going to give it is paint and then a space and then ###.png. Now the hash symbol represents the number in frames, so at this point it will replace it with 310, and if we were at the beginning on frame 1 it would put 001, and that's just a way of naming it that helps. We're then going to set the initial colour of the canvas to be a colour, and we can leave it at white because we're going to be painting black on. And now all we need to do is set up the actual brush, and that's very easy. So we select our brush, over to the physics panel, dynamic paint, brush, add brush, and then we simply want to paint in black. And that's all we have to do. Now, there's lots of settings here that you can play around with, but we don't need any of those other options. So I'm just going to go back to the canvas, and now we've set our directory where all our images are going to appear. They're going to be 1024 pixels by 1024, and the only thing we need to change is what frames we start from. And because on my computer it happens to be quite quick, I'm just going to leave it at the default, and it's detected that from the timeline range. So what I'm going to do now is press bake, and then I'll come back in a bit, and this folder will have filled up with all our dynamic paint images. So that is finally finished. I did have to change a few things. The rows were actually too wide, and so gaps were appearing in the baked out images. So I had to reduce the gap between this position and this position. There was an actual gap, so I had to reduce that as well. And now I have a folder full of images. Open some. So if I open this one, you can see that what we get is kind of blocky, and this is each point where the pen touches the canvas, it creates this, and you can see this line is just being drawn, and so we're then going to use this to reveal the image. So to do that, we're going to select our canvas, go to materials and select a new material. I'm going to reduce the specular intensity. I'll then add a new texture, and it says image or movie, and this time we are actually going to add the image sequence as a movie. So we're going to click open. I'm going to select our first image and press open, and instead of single image we're going to set it to be image sequence. This first number is the number of images to use. We're going to set this to be 434, or I am, because that's how long my animation is. And this number here is where we wanted to start in the timeline, and so we can leave that at 1. I'm going to tick auto refresh just so the images update. And if I scroll through, if you look up here, you can see the preview updating with our image sequence. We'll then also set it to be UV. It's not going to affect the colour. We're going to use RGB to intensity, and we're going to set it to be negative, and we're then going to use stencil. Now what stencil does is cut out an image onto the texture below. Now we haven't actually got a texture below yet, so I'll create that, and this will be the original image, the still image that we're using here. So it'll be this one. The mapping will be UV. It'll be affecting the colour. So if I click both and then flat, and then I'm just going to go back to the material, make sure it's solid white. If we then have a look at the material, what's actually happening is this top texture, which is the image sequence we just baked out, is masking out the texture until black is drawn on. And whenever black is drawn on, it will then reveal the image below. So by the time we get to the end, it's revealed all of it. And to prove that, we'll do a render. I'm just going to enable this other layer and this other one as well. Now we've got a few more props appearing. I've just got some small planes which are appearing as tape. I then have an area light, and you can see some of the settings here if you want to copy them down. And I have another one here which isn't casting a shadow. This one is. I then have this big object here, but really all it is a circle that's been extruded out and up, and then it has a subsurf applied to it. And in the world settings we've just got the default. And if I just select this camera and press Ctrl 0, what we should see is that only the image up to this point should be visible. So I'll just give that a render. So what we can see now it's rendered is that only the image that's been drawn up to that point by the dynamic pane is appearing, because it's acting as a stencil. And I also have a few materials. This material is just a fake reflection, so I've put a texture on the object, loaded in an image, and set it to map onto the reflection, so it's a fake reflection. But that's basically the effect. And just to go over what this texture is doing, when you set it to stencil, it will cut out part of the texture below. And because it's black and white, it will either cut some out or not cut some out. There'll be no kind of partly transparent parts. I set it to negative. If you don't do it negative, then it kind of works in reverse, in that everything that's black is already shown and everything that's white gets shown later on, which isn't what we want, so I put it to negative. Now there's really only one more thing to do, and that's to do the vector blur. So to do that, over in the rendering tab, under layers, we'll enable vector. We'll then have to re-render, so it takes into account the vector information we now want from the render, and after it's finished, we'll load up the compositor and do the vector blur. Just go over to the node editor. If you're not already on it, you just click on the compositing icon. We want to use nodes and the backdrop. Shift A, output viewer, and then Shift A, filter vector blur. So I'll just put that over there, link it to the output, and then pressing Alt V, we'll just zoom into the image a bit. And you can see we've now got a vector output on the render layer, which will plug into the speed, and then we'll plug the Z in as well. And you can see it's not very good quality, so set it to curved. Set the samples up to 64, and we'll turn the blur down to maybe 0.35. We'll put the samples up to something stupid like 100, and you start to get the idea of how the blur could work. Obviously it needs a bit of fine tuning. This system does work if you want to reveal an image that is more complicated, but you still will have to have it black and white so that the displacement works, so it can move up and down in the correct places, or you'd have to do that by hand. I hope you found this tutorial useful, and I hope you've learned something from it. I hope to see you in the next tutorial. Goodbye.